Chapter 21 of Quit Your Worrying by George Wharton James. The Worries of Impatience. How many of our worries come from impatience? We do not want to wait until the fruition of our endeavours comes naturally, until the time is ripe, until we are ready for that which we desire. We wish to overrule conditions which are beyond our power. We fail to accept the inevitable with a good grace. We refuse to believe in our circumscriptions, our limitations, and in our arrogance and pride express our anger, our indignation, our impatience. I have seen people whose auto has broken down, worried fearfully because they would not arrive somewhere as they planned, and in their impatient fretfulness they annoyed, angered, and upset all around them, without in one single degree improving their own condition or hastening the repair of the disaster. What folly! What more than childish foolishness! A child may be excused for its impatience and petulance, for it has not yet learned the inevitable facts of life, such as that brakes must be repaired, tires must be made so that they will not leak, and that the gasoline tank cannot be empty if the machine is to run. But a man, a woman, is supposed to have learned these incontrovertible facts, and should at the same time have learned acquiescence in them. A train is delayed. One has an important engagement. Worry seems inevitable and excusable. But is it? Where is the use? Will it replace the destroyed bridge, renew the washed-out track, repair the broken engine? How much better to submit to the inevitable, with graceful acceptance of the fact, than to fret, stew, worry, and at the same time irritate everyone around you. How serenely nature rebukes the impatience of the fretful worrier. A man plants corn, wheat, barley, potatoes, or trees that take 5, 7 years to come to bearing, such as the orange, olive, walnut, date, and so on. Let him fret ever so much, worry all he likes, chafe and fret every hour. Let him go and dig up his seeds or plants to urge their upgrowing. Let him even swear in his impatient worry and threaten to smash all his machinery, discharge his men, and turn his stock loose. Nature goes on her way, quietly, unmoved, serenely, unhurried, undisturbed by the folly of the one creature of earth who is so senseless as to worry, namely, man. Many a man's hair has turned grey, and many a woman's brow and cheeks have become furrowed, because of fretful, impatient worry over something that could not be changed, or hastened, or improved. My conception of life is that manhood, womanhood, should rise superior to any and all conditions and circumstances. Whatever happens, spirit should be supreme, superior, in control. And until we learn that lesson, life so far has failed. Inasmuch as we do learn it, life has become a success. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22. The Worries of Anticipation. He crosses every bridge before he comes to it, is a graphic and proverbial rendering of a description of the man who worries in anticipation. Something, sure, is going to happen. He is always fearful not of what is, but of what is going to be. For 20 years he has managed to live and pay his rent, but at the beginning of each month he begins afresh to worry where next month's rent is going to come from. He collected his bills fairly well for a business lifetime, but if a debtor fails to send in his cheque, on the very day he begins to worry and fear lest he fail to receive it. His wife has given him 4 children, but at the coming of the 5th, he is sure something extraordinarily painful and adverse is going to happen. He sees, possibly here I should say she sees, their son climbing a tree. She is sure he will fall and break a leg, an arm, or his neck. Her boy mustn't ride the horse, lest he fall and injure himself. If he goes to swim, he is surely in danger of being drowned. And she could never allow him or his sister to row in a boat, lest it be overturned. The child must be watched momentarily, lest it fall out of the window, search out a sharp knife, swallow poison, or do some irreparable damage to the bric-a-brac. Here let me relate an incident the truth of which is vouched for, and which clearly illustrates the difference between the attitude of worry and that of trust. One day, when Flatich, a pious minister of the Württemberg, was seated in his armchair, one of his foster children fell out of a second-story window, right before him, to the pavement below. He calmly ordered his daughter to go and bring up the child. On doing so, it was found the little one had sustained no injury. A neighbour, however, aroused by the noise, came in and reproached Flatich for his carelessness and inattention. While she was thus remonstrating, her own child, which she had brought with her, fell from the bench upon which she had seated it, and broke its arm. "Do you see, good woman," said the minister, "if you imagine yourself to be the sole guardian of your child, then you must constantly carry it in your arms. I commend my children to God, and even though they then fall, they are safer than were I to devote my whole time and attention to them." Those who anticipate evils for their children too often seem to bring down upon their loved ones the very evils they are afraid of. And one of the greatest lessons of life, and one that brings immeasurable and uncountable joys when learned, is that Nature, the great father-mother of us all, is kindly disposed to us. We need not be so alarmed, so fearful, so anticipatory of evil at her hands. Charles Warren Stoddard used to tell of the great dread Mark Twain was wont to feel during the exhaustion and reaction he felt at the close of each of his lectures, lest he should become incapable of further writing and lecturing, and therefore become dependent upon his friends, and die a pauper. How wonderfully he conquered this demon of perpetual worry, all those who know his life are aware. How that, when his publisher failed, he took upon himself a heavy financial burden, for which he was in no way responsible, went on a lecture tour around the world, and paid every cent of it, and finally died with his finances in a most prosperous condition. The anticipatory worries of others are just as senseless, foolish, and absurd as were those of Mark Twain, and it is possible for every man to overcome them, even as did he. The cloud we anticipate seldom if ever comes, and then generally in a different direction from where we sought it. Time spent on looking for the cloud and figuring how much of injury it will do us had better be utilized in garnering the hay crop, bringing in the lambs, or hauling warm fodder and bedding for them. There is another side, however, to this worrying anticipation of troubles. The ancient philosophers recognized it. Lucan wrote, "The very fear of approaching evil has driven many into peril." There are those who believe that the very concentration of thought upon a possible evil will bring to pass the peculiar arrangement of circumstances that makes the evil. Of this belief I am not competent to speak, but I am fully assured that it is far from helpful to be contemplating the possibility of evil. In my own life I have found that worrying over evils in anticipation has not prevented their coming, and, on the other hand, that where I have boldly faced the situation without fear and its attendant worries, the evil has fled. Hence, whether worries in hand or worries to come, worries real or worries imaginary, the wise, sane, and practical course is to kill them all, and thus quit your worrying. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23. How our worry affects others. If worry affected merely ourselves, it would be bad enough, but we could tolerate it more than we do. For it is one of the infernal characteristics of worry that our manifestation of it invariably affects others as injuriously as it affects ourselves. An employer who worries his employees never gets the good work out of them as does the one who has sense enough to keep them happy, good-natured, and contented. I was lecturing once for a large corporation. I had 2 colleagues who spelled me every hour. For much of the time we had no place to rest, work, or play between our lectures. Our engagement lasted the better part of a year, and the result was that, during that period where our reasonable needs were unprovided for, we all failed to give as good work as we were capable of. We were unnecessarily worried by inadequate provision, and our employers suffered. Henry Ford and men of his type have learned this lesson. Men respond rapidly to those who do not worry them. Governor Hunt and Warden Sims of Arizona have learned the same fact in dealing with prisoners of the state penitentiary. The less the men are worried by unnecessarily harsh treatment, absurd and cruel restrictions, curtailment of natural rights, the better they act, the easier they are liable to reform and make good. Dr. Musgrove, in his Nervous Breakdowns, tells a story of 2 commanders which well illustrates this point. Quote, "In a certain war, 2 companies of men had to march an equal distance in order to meet at a particular spot. The one arrived in perfect order and with few signs of exhaustion, although this march had been an arduous one. The other company reached the place utterly done up and disorganized. It was all a question of leadership. The captain of the first company had known his way and kept his men in good order, while the captain of the second company had never been sure of himself, and had harassed his subordinates with a constant succession of orders and counter-orders, until they had hardly known whether they were on their heads or their heels. That was why they arrived completely demoralized." End quote. In war, as in peace, it is not work that kills so much as worry. A general may make his soldiers work to the point of exhaustion, as Napoleon often did, yet have their almost adoring worship. But the general who worries his men gets neither their good will nor good work. A worrying mother can keep a whole house in a turmoil, from father down to the latest baby. The growing boys and girls soon learn to dread the name of home, and would rather be in school, in the backyard playing, in the attic, at the neighbours', or in the streets, anywhere, than within the sound of their mother's worrying voice or frowning countenance. A worrying husband can drive his wife distracted, and vice versa. I was dining not long ago with a couple that, from outward appearance, had everything that heart could desire to make them happy. They were young, healthy, had a good income, were both engaged in work they liked. Yet the husband worried the wife constantly about trifles. If she wished to set the table in a particular way, he worried because she didn't do it some other way. If she drove one of their autos, he worried because she didn't take the other. And when she wore a spring day flowery kind of a hat, he worried because his mother never wore any other than a black hat. The poor woman was distracted by the absolute absurdities, frivolities, and inconsequentialities of his worries. Yet he didn't seem to have sense to see what he was doing. So I gave him a plain, practical talk, as I had been drawn into a discussion of the matter without any volition on my part, and urged him to quit irritating his wife so foolishly and so unnecessarily. Some teachers worry their pupils until the latter fail to do the work they are competent to do, and the want of success of many an ambitious teacher can often be attributed to his/her worrying disposition. Remember, therefore, that when you worry, you are making others unhappy as well as yourself. You are putting a damper, a blight, upon other lives as well as your own. You are destroying the efficiency of other workers as well as your own. You are robbing others of the joy of life which God intended them freely to possess, so that for the sake of others, as well as your own, it becomes an imperative duty that you quit your worrying. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. Worry versus indifference. The aim and object of all striving in life should be to grow more human, more humane, less selfish, more helpful to our fellows. Any system of life that fails to meet this universal need is predestined to failure. When therefore I urge upon my readers that they quit their worrying about their husbands or wives, sons and daughters, neighbours and friends, the wicked and the good, I do not mean that they are to harden their hearts and become indifferent to their welfare. God forbid. No student of the human heart, of human life, and of the Bible can long ignore the need of a caution upon these lines. The sacred writer knew what he was talking about when he spoke of the human heart as deceitful and desperately wicked. It is deceitful, or it would never blind people as it does to the inutility, the futility of much of their goodness, a goodness that is wrapped up in a napkin and lies unused for the benefit of others, rots and becomes a putrid mass of corruption. It can only remain good by being unselfishly used for the good of others. And to prove that the human heart is desperately wicked, one needs only to look at the suffering endured by mankind unnecessarily, suffering that organized society ought to prevent and render impossible. The parable of the lost sheep was written to give us this needful lesson. The shepherd, when he found one of his sheep gone, did not sit down and wring his hands in foolish and useless worry as to what would happen to the sheep, the dangers that would beset it, the thorns, the precipices, the wolves. Nor did he count over the times he had cautioned the sheep not to get away from its fellows. Granted that it was conceited, self-willed, refused to listen to counsel, disobedient, the main fact in the mind of the shepherd was that it was lost, unprotected, in danger, afraid, cold, hungry, longing for the sheepfold, the companionship of its fellows, and the guardianship of the shepherd. Hence he went out eagerly and sympathetically, and searched until he found it and brought it back to shelter. This, then, should be the spirit of those who have heeded my caution and advice to quit their worrying about their loved ones and others. Do not worry, but do not, under any consideration, become hard-hearted, careless, or indifferent. Better by far preserve your interest and the human tenderness that leads you to the useless and needless expenditure of energy and sympathy in worry, than that you should let your loved ones suffer without any care, thought, or endeavour on their behalf. But do not let it be a sympathy that leads to worry. Let it be helpful, stimulating, directive, energizing in the good. Overcome evil with good. Resist evil, and it will flee from you. So long as those you love are absorbed in the things that in the past have led you to worry over them, be tender and sympathetic with them. Surround them with your holy and helpful love. Jesus was tender and compassionate with all who were sick or diseased in body or mind. He was never angry with any, save the proud and self-righteous Pharisees. He tenderly forgave the adulterous woman, justified the publican, and never lectured or rebuked those who came to have their bodily and mental infirmities removed by him. Let us then be tender with the erring and the sinful, rather than censorious and full of rebuke. Is it not the better way to point out the right, overcome the evil with the good, and thus bind our erring loved ones more firmly to ourselves? Surely our own errors, failures, weaknesses, and sins ought to have taught us this lesson. In the bedroom of a friend where I recently slept was a card on which was illuminated these words, which bear particularly upon this subject. Quote, "The life that has not known and accepted sorrow is strangely crude and untaught. It can neither help nor teach, for it has never learned. The life that has spurned the lesson of sorrow, or failed to read it aright, is cold and hard. But the life that has been disciplined by sorrow is courageous and full of holy and gentle love." End quote. And it is this holy, gentle, and courageous love that we need to exercise every day towards those who require it, rather than the worry that frets, still more irritates, and widens the gulf already existent. So, reader, don't worry, but help sympathetically and lovingly, and above all, don't become indifferent, hard-hearted, and selfish. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. Worries and Hobbies. Though these words are much alike in sound, they have no sympathy one with another. Put them in active operation, and they rush at each other's throats far worse than Allies and Germans are now fighting. They strive for a death grip, and as soon as one gets hold, he hangs on to the end, if he can. Yet, as in all conflicts, the right is sure to win in an equal combat. The right of the hobby is absolutely certain to win over the wrong of the worry. Webster defines a hobby as a subject or plan which one is constantly setting off, or a favourite and ever recurring theme of discourse, thought, or effort. But the editor of the Century Dictionary has a better definition, more in accord with modern thought, namely, that which a person persistently pursues or dwells upon with zeal or delight, as if riding a horse. Are you cursed by the demon of worry? Has he got a death grip on your throat? Do you want to be freed from his throttling assaults? If so, get a hobby, the more mentally occupying the better, and ride it earnestly, sincerely, furiously. Let it be what it will far more than pay in the end, when you find yourself free from the nightmare of worry that has so relentlessly ridden you for so long. Collect bugs, old china, Indian baskets, Indian blankets, pipes, domestic implements, war paraphernalia, photographs, butterflies. Make a herbarium of the flowers of your state. Collect postage stamps, old books, first editions. Go in for extra illustrating books. Pick up and classify all the stray phrases you hear. Do anything that will occupy your mind to the exclusion of worry. And let me here add a thought. The more unselfish you can make your hobby, the better it will be for you. Perhaps I can put it even in a better way yet. The less your hobby is entered into with the purely personal purpose of pleasing yourself, and the more actively you can make it beneficial, helpful, joy-giving to others, the more potent for good it will be in aiding you to get rid of your worries. He who blesses another is thrice blessed, for he not only blesses himself by the act, but brings upon himself the blessing of the recipient and of Almighty God, with the oft-added blessing of those who learn of the good deed and breathe a prayer of commendation for him. In San Francisco there is a newspaper man who writes in a quaint, peculiar, simple yet subtle fashion, who signs himself KCB. During the Panama Pacific Exposition, one of his hobbies was to plan to take there all the poor youngsters of the streets, the newsboys, the little ones in hospitals, the incurables, the down-and-outers of the workhouse and poor farm, and finally the almost forgotten old men and women of the almshouses. I saw strong men weep with deep emotion at the procession of automobiles conveying the happy, though generally silent throngs on one of these occasions, and KCB must have felt the showers of blessings that were sent in his direction from those who saw and appreciated his beautiful helpfulness. There is nothing to hinder any man, woman, youth, or maiden from doing exactly the same kind of thing, with the same spirit, and bringing a few hours of happiness to the needy, thus driving worry out of the mind, putting it hors de combat, so that it need never again rise from the field. Every blind asylum, children's hospital, slum, old ladies' home, old man's home, almshouse, poor farm, workhouse, insane asylum, prison, and 1,000 other centres where the poor, needy, sick, and afflicted gather, has its lonely hearts that long for cherishing, aching brows that need to be soothed, pain to be alleviated. And there is no panacea so potent in removing the worries of our own life as to engage earnestly in removing the positive and active ills of others. People occasionally ask me if I have any hobby that has helped me ward off the attacks of worry. I do not believe I have ever answered this question as fully as I might have done, so I will attempt to do so now. One of my first hobbies was food reform and hygienic living. When I was little more than 12 years of age, I became a vegetarian, and for 9 years lived the life pretty rigorously. I have always believed that simpler, plainer living than most of us indulge in, more open-air life, sleeping, working, living out of doors, more active physical exercise of a useful character, would be beneficial. Then I became a student of memory culture. Professor William Stokes of the Royal Polytechnic Institution became my friend, and for years I studied his system of mnemonics, or as it was generally termed, artificial memory. Then I taught it for a number of years, and evolved from it certain fundamental principles upon which I have largely based the cultivation of my own memory and mentality, and for which I can never be sufficiently thankful. Then I desired to be a public speaker. I became a hobbyist on pronunciation, enunciation, purity of voice, phrasing, and getting the thought of my own mind in the best and quickest possible way into the minds of others. For years I kept a small book in which I jotted down every word, its derivation and full meaning, with which I was not familiar. I studied clear enunciation by the hour. Indeed, as I walked through the streets, I recited to myself aloud, so that I could hear my own enunciation, such poems as Southey's Cataract of Lodore, where almost every word terminates in ing. For I had heard many great English and American speakers whose failure to pronounce this terminal ing in such words as coming, going, and so on, used to distress me considerably. Other exercises were the catches such as Peter Piper picks a peck of pickled peppers, or Selina Seamstitch stitches 7 seams slowly, surely, serenely, and slovenly, or around a rugged rock a ragged rascal ran a rural race. Then, too, Professor Stokes has composed a wonderful yarn about the memory, entitled My M Made Memory Medley, mentioning memory's most marvellous manifestations. This took up as much as 3 or 4 pages of this book, every word beginning with M. It was a marvellous exercise for lingual development. He also had the far-famed fairy tale of Fenella, and these were constantly and continuously recited with scrupulous care as to enunciation. My father was an old-time conductor of choral and oratorio societies, and was the leader of a large choir. I had a good alto voice, and under his wise discipline it was cultivated, and I was a certificated reader of music at sight before I was 10 years old. Then I taught myself to play the organ, and before I was 20 I was the organist and choirmaster of one of the largest congregational churches of my native town, having often helped my father in the past years to drill and conduct oratorios such as The Messiah, Elijah, The Creation, and so on. When I began to speak in public, the only special instruction I had for the cultivation of the voice was a few words from my father to this effect: Stand before the looking-glass, and insist that your face appear pleasant and agreeable. Speak the sentence you wish to hear. Listen to your own voice. You can tell as well as anyone else whether its sound is nasal, harsh, raucous, disagreeable, affected, or in any way displeasing or unnatural. Insist upon a pure, clear, natural, pleasing tone. And that's all there is to it. When you appear before an audience, speak to the persons at the further end of the hall, and if they can hear you, don't worry about anyone else. Later, when I had become fairly launched as a public speaker, he came to visit me, and when I appeared on my platform that night, I found scattered around on the floor, where none could see them but myself, several placards upon which he had printed in easily read capitals, "Don't shout," "Keep cool," "Avoid ranting," "Make each point clear," "Don't ramble," and so on. When I was about 14, I took up phonography, or stenography as it is now known. This was an aid in reporting speeches, making notes and so on, but one of its greatest helps was in the matter of analysing the sounds of words, thus aiding me in their clear enunciation. At this time I was also a Sunday school teacher, and at 16 years of age a local preacher in the Methodist Church. This led to my becoming an active minister of that denomination after I came to the United States, and for 7 years I was as active as I knew how to be in the discharge of this work. In my desire to make my preaching effective and helpful, I studied unweariedly, and took up astronomy, buying a 3-inch telescope, and soon became elected to fellowship in the Royal Astronomical Society of England. Then I took up microscopy, buying the fine microscope from Dr. Dallinger, President of the Royal Microscopical Society, with which he had done his great work on bacilli, and which, by the way, was later stolen from me, and I was speedily elected a Fellow of that distinguished society. A little later, Joseph LeConte, the beloved geologist of the California State University, took me under his wing and set me to work solving problems in geology, and I was elected in due time a Fellow of the Geological Society of England, a society honoured by the counsels of such men as Tyndall, Murchison, Lyell, and all the great geologists of the English-speaking world. Just before I left the ministry in 1889, I took up, with a great deal of zeal, the study of the poet Browning. I had already yielded to the charm of Ruskin, whom I personally knew, and Carlyle. But Browning opened up a new world of elevated thought to me, in which I am still a happy dweller. In seeking a new vocation, I naturally gravitated towards several lines of thought and study, all of which have influenced materially my later life, and all of which I pursued with the devotion accorded only to hobbies. These were 1. A deeper study of nature in her larger manifestations, as the Grand Canyon of Arizona, the Petrified Forest, the Yosemite Valley, the big trees, the high Sierras, with their snow-clad summits, glaciers, lakes, canyons, forests, flora and fauna, the Colorado and Mojave deserts, the Colorado River, the Painted Desert, and the many regions upon which I have written books. 2. The social conditions of the submerged tenth, which led to my writing of a book on The Dark Places of Chicago, which was the stimulating cause of W.T. Stead's soul-stirring book, If Christ Came to Chicago. Here was and is the secret of my interest in all problems dealing with social unrest, the treatment of the poor and sinful, and so on, for I was chaplain for 2 years of 2 homes for unfortunate women and girls. 3. A deeper study of the Indians, in whom I had always been interested, and which has led to my several books on the Indians themselves, their basketry, blanketry, and so on. 4. A more detailed study of the literature of California and the West, and also 5. A more comprehensive study of the development of California and other Western states, in order that I might lecture more acceptably upon these fascinating themes. Here, then, are some of the hobbies that have made and are making my life what it is. I leave it to my readers to determine which has been the better, to spend my hours, days, weeks, months, and years in getting my livelihood and worrying, or in providing for my family and myself, and spending all the spare time I had upon these many and varied hobbies, some of which have developed into my life work. And I sincerely hope I shall be absolved from any charge of either self-glorification or egotism in this recital of personal experiences. At the time I was passing through them, I had no idea of their great value. They were the things to which something within me bade me flee, to find refuge from the worries that were destroying me. And it is because of their triumphant success that I now recount them, in the fervent desire that they may bring hope to despondent souls, give courage to those who are now wavering, uncertain and pessimistic, and thus rid them of the demons of fret and worry. Now that I have come to my final words, where all my final admonitions should be placed, I find I have little left to say. I have said it all, reader, in the chapters you have read, or skipped. Indeed, I have not so much cared to preach to you myself, as to encourage, incite you to do your own preaching. This is by far the most effective, permanent, and lasting. Improvement can come only from within. A seed of desire may be sown by an outsider, but it must grow in the soil of your soul, be harboured, sheltered, cared for, and finally beloved by your own very self, before it will flower into new life for you. That you may possess this new life, a life of work, of achievement, of usefulness to others, is my earnest desire. And this can come only to its fullest fruition in those who have learned to quit worrying. End of chapter 25. End of Quit Your Worrying by George Wharton James.